So we continue. Okay, so Saussure's binary then. Saussure's binary is something that we're not really going to discuss now because it's not necessary to discuss now, but we're going to very quickly look at langue and parole. Okay, so Saussure, and a few of you have, I've been through this with you, with a few of you, with a substantial number of you, and the rest of you. Okay, so the signifier, which was initially an artifact, then became a signifier when the sign was motivated, and now we have a signified, becomes a sign. Saussure told us that, look, there are these two things within language, and they're called langue and parole. And langue is the structural aspects of a language, said Saussure. What we have ready, what we've learned, what we have ready at our disposal, tools, ammunition to fire when we communicate. We're going into a battle, a communicative battle, and we're going to fire with what we have. And it's not going to be formulaic because, our targets are running around. We have to, shoot at them. So we're just going to shoot in any way we can and hope for the best. Hope that our aim is good enough so that our ammunition hits the target. Okay. So Saussure is telling us that langue is the structural aspects of a language. And he tells us that parole is the unfolding in time of a set of possibilities given spatially. And the key word there is spatially. Spatially. He's saying that there's all these things that we have in a certain space, be it a cognitive space, a virtual space, a real space, and these unfold in time. So this set of possibilities of what we have in langue unfolds in time. It unfolds. It opens up and presents itself, and it becomes a reality, a communicative reality within the network or system or semiotic matrix. Now, if we quickly look at an example, we'll have a quick look at an example, and the example is of the signified. So there's a stick there. Have a look at the stick, and we have our signifier, artifact, signified formula there, and the sign, the motivated sign, of course, and the stick. What does the stick mean? The stick, I show you a picture of this long brown thing, tanny, goldy brown thing, and I want you to signify it. So what are you going to say? One of you may say that, or some of you may say that, look, this is a weapon. You use it in Kung Fu, and you jump down from the roof after, flying around, like in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And if you've seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is really a great film, yeah, it's a great film. It's a wonderful film. It's one of my 5 top films, in fact. Liang. If you've seen it, you've seen people, jumping from roof to roof and flying around, and it's magic Kung Fu using their chi and everything. It's great. Okay, so you see the stick, and you think, okay, well, this is a Kung Fu stick, and people jump from the roof and beat each other up, and there you go. Another person may say, well, this is a rod for a house. So it's signified in a different way. It's a rod for a house, and you put it in your wall and it holds up your house or something, especially if you live in a cottage, a wooden cottage, and so forth. And the third thing may be, well, I don't know, it's a back massager where, in some countries like in Japan, they use sticks to hit themselves on the back with, and it's sort of like massaging. It's not sadistic in any way. It's just, the grandmothers and grandfathers in Japan like to do this. They pat themselves, or with a little force, they hit themselves on the back, and it's great. It's just a nice massage, and they have all these nice, very non-modern things in Japan, including an empty cylindrical structure that they sleep with, and you put your arms and your legs around it while you sleep, and it's really comfortable. It's really great. And Japan has many comforts that help people of all ages, and I certainly have experienced some of those, and they're very comfortable, and I recommend that you try. Okay, so we interpret that in different ways. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you some more questions. I'm going to ask you, number one, do we recognize signs through their opposition to things they are not? Is that how we recognize signs? When you look at something, a chair, or a football, or a banana, or a person, my friend John. How do we recognize these things, these people? Because they are not something else? Do we say, well, John isn't Bob, and John isn't Mary, and John certainly isn't my grandmother, so, is that how we recognize John? Number two, do we recognize signs through simple familiarity with only that sign? So do we recognize John because he is John? Are signs motivated? That is, are natural connections between the signifier and signified? How short-lived is the interpretation of meaning? Is it static or dynamic? The interpretation, is it very, very instantaneous, or is it a long process? Okay, now let's move on to something that's very central to Saussure's work, and something we've begun to discuss, and something that I think is important to discuss. And it's, I guess, timely because we've spent a substantial amount of time on it. It's arbitrariness and difference. The word arbitrary and the word different. Okay. Saussure tells us that there is no natural or inherent relationship between that which carries meaning, the signifier, usually the word or symbol, and the actual meaning which is carried, the signified. There's no natural or inherent relationship between these two. He says that a signifier, a word, refers to a concept and not a thing is very important. But actually, this is not new. In fact, John Locke, in his essay on human understanding, we said before, had already suggested this. However, what Saussure tells us is that there are two new things that he builds around. This idea of not being natural, the unnaturalness of the connection between the sign, the signifier, and the signified. Okay. So Saussure tells us that there are two new things, and they're very foundational in his work on semiotics. Saussure tells us that we differentiate signs, either language in the aggregate, that is, clusters of signs and associations of relations with each other, everything at once. Remember, language is spatially aggregate. Okay, it's all there. It happens all at once, and it's all there at once. It unfolds in time, but language is all there. We can select from a billion different combinations, words, permutations, at any time, okay, depending on the context. Language exists as an aggregate. And Saussure tells us that we differentiate signs, either language in the aggregate or in speech acts, when signs exist adjacently in sequence, temporal sequence, through a process of differentiality. What does differentiality mean? Well, language is a system of formal relations. The key to understanding the structure of the system lies in difference, says Saussure. One sound differs from another sound as P differs to B. One word differs from another as cat differs to mat. And one grammatical form differs from another as has drunk differs to will drink. No linguistic unit, the sound or word, has significance in and of itself. Each unit acquires meaning in conjunction with other units, says Saussure. The only factor that allows us to recognize something is that it's not something else. This is called negativity. It's not something else. You are not Bob, you are not John, you're definitely not my grandmother, which means that's how I recognize you. This is what Saussure says. This is differentiation. So Saussure tells us then that there is a sign, and by now he's developed a lot of work on the sign, and people are very interested in his work on the sign. So he's starting to really progress with his ideas of the sign. And remember that Saussure's work was not published while he was alive. It was published posthumously. So it was published after he died by his students. We know that. Okay, we've discussed his students as well, and we can discuss them later if you like. And I certainly have a lot to say about his students. But okay, so Saussure taught all this in his courses. It was his course in general linguistics, and it was published. So it's not like he planned to publish, but he did keep working on this and developing his ideas. And after his death, it was all put on paper and everything. Okay, so the sign. And the sign is arbitrary and differential, says Saussure. And hence, there is no such thing as a natural physical sign, says Saussure. So this arbitrariness and this differentiality both indicate very strongly that the sign is not physical. Yes, that's what happens, okay? That's what it means for the sign not to be physical, that the signification is arbitrary and it's also differential. Once you take away another sign, then this sign ceases to exist, which means that it's not physical, it's not natural. But as soon as you bring in that other sign, then this sign takes form. There's no known language that exists with which to know things positively, only negatively, says Saussure. I know something because it is not everything else, through a direct relationship with adjacent objects, through similarity or dissimilarity. Now, this becomes very interesting. There's been a lot of work and discourse and debate on this. There's a lot to say, and I don't think we should really get into this right now, but what we can say is that when we want to know about a chair, or when we hear about a chair, when we see the chair object or the word chair, we don't spend 5 hours thinking, this is not a table, this is not an eraser, it's definitely not my grandmother, it's not any of the food I ate. So by the time you've gone through everything in the world, your friends have gone thinking, this guy's crazy, I'm never going to sit down and have lunch with this guy again because he's just, he's got problems. So I'm going to, stay home and play a computer game or something, not meet Michael anymore. However, at specific times, we do engage in this differentiation. At the same time, we contextualize. And it all depends on, how well we know the concept of chair, because if we have so many associations with around this concept of chair, then the identifying of the object chair and forming a cognitive image or concept is very instantaneous, okay, because we have so many associations. But if you're developing a new language, say I'm developing my skill in a new language, say in the Malay language, and I want to learn a new word, which is memang, M-E-M-A-N-G, which means indeed. Indeed, I think, memang, now I've heard that word. What does it mean? Does it mean people? No, because I know that people means this and this. Does it mean food? No. Does it mean coconut? No. So I gradually go around to all these things and all these other words and items, and I say, well, it's not this, not this, not this. And that's a very coarse example and very gross example. However, this is, it's a good example of how language works and how signification works. Okay, you look for signs and you say, well, it can't be that, can't be that, can't be that. And you gradually, interpolate. And in the end, you think, oh, yeah, it must be indeed. I recall, what's the word for indeed? And indeed, I can't think of any other word for indeed. And then you think back and everything, and you associate, disassociate, and you look for similarities, dissimilarities, and difference, and okay. But look, that's something we will, I promise you, I give you my word, we will get into that much later on. Because association and how it works with signification and Lacanian theory and everything is quite complex, but a lot of fun. Okay, so what is language? Language is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each results solely from the simultaneous presence of others. Okay, so this is very Saussurean. Saussure tells us that it's a system. Language is a system. And it's a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results slowly from the simultaneous presence of others. So it's spatial, not temporal, says Saussure. So Saussure tells us that, number one, the value of a sound cannot be determined except by its contents and by everything that surrounds it. Okay, so Saussure is speaking about, number one, the association we have with the sound and the differentiality. He then tells us that segments of language can only in their final analysis be based on non-coincidence with other segments. The arbitrariness and differentiality become correlative qualities. So arbitrariness and differentiality somehow correlate with each other. The concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positivity, but negatively by relations with other parts of a system. So, he keeps stressing this, and we keep stressing this, not to convince you that it's true, but to indicate how strongly Saussure advocates this idea of differentiality and arbitrariness. So, to take an example, let me give you an example. The very famous and the common stoplight example. We have three lights. We have a red, orange, and green light. And if we only had red in our repertoire of colors universally, there's only red, right? First of all, we wouldn't see much, would we? We'd see shades of red, I guess, but if we only had red in one shade, then of course nothing would be visible. So if we only had red, then street lights wouldn't make much sense. You have red, red, red. Yeah, I guess you could say, well, the top one is stop and the bottom red is go, but then in the middle of the night you wouldn't really be able to articulate between top, middle, and bottom. Okay, and you probably have more difficulty remembering because I guess colors are easier to remember than spatial arrangements. The other thing is that if the street lights, if we had, of course, all the colors in the spectrum, but the street lights had only red, 3 reds, then that would be pointless, I guess. But also there'd be much less differential value, okay, in that semiotic matrix. Okay, so the difference, red, orange, and yellow, is quite stark. And by looking at these lights in their differentiation, in all their differentiation, we see that, okay, there is a difference, and we can well articulate that red means something distinct. Okay. So in the semiotic matrix that we call a system, we compare everything an object is not. Okay. So when an object is not something, we compare it to what it is not. But to do this is very difficult, if not impossible. You can't, like I said before, you cannot sit there for an hour while your friend asks you, what's this thing? So, well, it's not an eraser, it's not a banana, it's not my school teacher. You cannot do this. So you have to, and of course you cannot attempt to compare it with everything you've ever learned in the world, so you have to then narrow it down. So what do you say? You say, well, okay, let's at least narrow it down to context, okay? To context. Context is very important, because at least if we get context, we can narrow something down to respond very quickly. And, so I'm on a game show, and they ask me who was the world's best baseball player, or who was MVP in the White Sox New York game last week, and you have to, very quickly get to it. You can't, you have to get within the context that you're discussing. And if you know anything about Ausubel and his subsumption theory, then that becomes quite relevant, because Ausubel did discuss that we do subsume things under certain categories or within certain categories, and that assists us to think and everything. Okay, so if we know its purpose, this suggests knowing it positively and negatively. it helps us to know it positively and negatively. We know things due to their conventional nature and the conventional nature of their environment. Not because of the many environments that exist, but because of the very immediate or most immediate environment. So if the system, says Saussure, if the system or conventional cultural nature are unknown, then we cannot identify the object or have great difficulty in identifying nonetheless. We can only know something because of not what it is within a certain system. Okay, within a certain system. Fine, sometimes there's bleeding, there's a semiotic bleeding, what I call bleeding, and you at times incorporate elements from outside the system, but that just suggests that these elements which were in other ways outside the system now become a new semiotic matrix. And they become their own system, okay? A certain system doesn't mean that it has to be the same language. It could be a different language. You could be developing your ideas of a new language and developing your competence in a new language, and somebody says, well, I'm going to teach you Italian, and here's the word in Italian for dog, D-O-G, and it's cane. And say, cane. What does that mean? What does that mean? I know in English, yeah, that's right, cane is dog, but that's in English, right? So, so then you're including the English dog, so the semiotic matrix ceases to be Italian, it's now dog across different languages. And that becomes its own system. So it's delocalized, a delocalized system. All right, so the intelligibility of sign systems is their conventionality, says Saussure. If something is conventional, then it's intelligible. So we continue. Now, once again, the negatively assigned object, or the object that has been identified negatively, is not other things. So negatively, an object is not other things. But positively, it approximates what we need. Negatively, it cannot be something in another language, nor can it be something else in this language. So it must be positively identified within the system we know. So here we're looking at two different competing, and this is very important when we later look at semiotics anthropologically, we're looking at two competing forces, because there's a negative aspect and a positive aspect, and they're both pushing and pulling, saying, well, it's not this and this, but it could be something that resembles this and this, so it's kind of in the middle. A dog isn't a cat, but it could be a terrier, a bull terrier, or a Dalmatian, or something. Identifying the object forms a locus of points, both phonologically and semantically, but also contextually. So a locus of points. So it's not this and this and this, but it could be this and this and this, and it's not this and this and this, but it could be this and this and this, and also contextually. So we're looking at three different axes. So this is where we begin to look at things anthropologically. I'm going to, of course, expand on this and elaborate on this later. But these three different axes which work together, and there's a locus of points and possibilities, because when we approximate, we're talking about possibilities. And when we speak of a matrix and a system, we can only speak about possibilities, right? So this forms a sphere or a bubble which shifts and changes according to the semiotic adherences and necessities of the signification. I'm going to now tell you quickly about Saussure's paradigmatic and syntagmatic ideas and notions, and I'm going to go through this quickly only because it's not that necessary that we discuss it now. And later on, when we speak of the structure of language according to Saussure and according to Levi-Strauss and others, then we will definitely look at these very closely and extensively. Okay, Saussure tells us that there are two things in language, and one is the paradigmatic aspect, and one is the syntagmatic aspect. The paradigmatic aspect, Saussure tells us, is the vertical axis. The syntagmatic or syntagmic axis is the horizontal one. And he tells us that the paradigmatic is a group of patterns that are latent or hidden, and they show their meaning through similarity or difference, through an opposite equivalent. We see how these pieces fit together, thus finding hidden patterns that contribute to an overall meaning. The paradigmatic aspect of language is the replacement of words to fit the context. That's all it is, the replacement of words to fit the context. So, I love ice cream. Well, you could put, I love chocolate. John loves chocolate. John hates chocolate. You know, all of that. But you cannot use I love jump. I love jump. Although you can nounify the word jump and make the word jump. I love jump. You cannot say I went ice cream, although went is a verb. You have to correctly avoid a misfire, as, you know, if we look at Austinian and Husserlian and Gricean language theories, we can say that, look, if you were to say that I went ice cream, that would be a misfire. Okay, the syntagmic or syntagmatic aspect of language is, of course, the sequential arrangement of words in a sentence, and through the syntagmatic, we find meaning through a certain linear growth. That is, the chains of sign events, actions or signs that lead to a correct or effective understanding of how meaning emerges. So I'm now going to extend on the thing that I spoke about just prior, and this is the semiotic equilibrium that I spoke about. If we look at the diagram that I'm showing you at the top left, there's a sphere. You can see a sphere, and there are two axes there, one going up and down, and the other one going left and right. Now, this is where I think that structuralism, and of course, when we apply this later on to Peirce, remember Peirce, and of course, Derrida later on, and everything, and you know, and so forth, and Lacan, and when we look at Gunther Kress and others as well, when we look at Silverstein and everything, and this is where it gets very interesting, because this is where we really create an anthropology of linguistics, linguistic anthropology. But you know, that's far, far away, and you know, we're still on Earth. We're trying to get to the Andromeda galaxy, but we're still on Earth, so we haven't even invented our spaceship yet. Okay, so we see our sphere, and we see two axes, and at the top, let's call that the y-axis, the up-down one. There's a plus at the top, and there's a minus at the bottom. And the x-axis, there's a minus at the left and a plus on the right. Okay, so we call the y-axis the semantic values. Semantic, the meaning, there's a plus and a minus. And the x-axis, we call that the phonological, set of phonological values. The sound, okay, sound, culturally appropriated sound. That's what phonology is, the study of culturally appropriated sound in language. Okay, so the y-axis, let's take the word rose, and you know what a rose is, right? It's a flower, it's a pink flower, red flower, white flower, and sometimes other colors. The y-axis is the semantic aspect of the word rose. So if we look at the word rose and we say, well, what's a rose? Then negatively, if we look at this negatively, we say, well, it's not a lily, it's not a daffodil, it's not a sunflower, it's not a violet, it's not a daisy, it's not a chrysanthemum. However, a rose is red, it has 30 petals, it's thorny, it has a nice smell, okay, it's soft, and grows in bunches. The positive aspect of the rose is that it's a flower, it's red, it has 30 petals. The negative aspect is it's not this and this and this, okay? So there's an equilibrium between what it isn't and what it is. And there's a locus of points, and we have to somehow place it along these points. And we have to find the approximate value depending on, of course, what we believe it is, culturally and cognitively, what we need it for. Number two, the phonological equilibrium. Well, a rose is not a nose, not a bows, not a pose, not a hose, not a road, not a roam, not a raise. However, different pronunciations have it differently. You know, you got a blocked nose and you say it's a road. Or if you're Australian, you say it's a rose, rose, rose. It's a rose, mate. Or if you're Italian Australian, you say it's a rose, it's a rose. Or if you're Italian Australian, you say it's a rose. Okay. Or if you're Italian, you may say it's a rose. So in Italy, they say it's a rose. In Greece, they may say it's a ros. So that still means it's a rose, but phonologically, you know, there are cultural differences, and they stem from language interference and stuff. So there's also a locus of points along which we can place the word rose phonologically. And that becomes predicated on the cultural context or other things. Whether you have a cold, or, you know, whether the wind's blowing and you don't say it very loudly and half the words cut off or something. Okay. So we're only going to speak about these two axes now. So the point here that I'm making is what we're going to talk about now. If you look at the next diagram, which is again the sphere, and I point to the, this is the semiotic equilibrium diagram, and we have the sphere again, and we have, to the right we have the y-axis and the x-axis, and we describe where the word rose goes phonologically and semantically. And we see that it can sit anywhere along any of these axes, or either of these axes, positive, negative, and that means that it can sit anywhere within the sphere of this system. Okay? The sphere is the system, and within the sphere there's a small bubble that can only be the word, the concept, the sign of rose. So the semiotic coordinates of the word rose, see, it's not a point, it's not an exact point because of the variation that we said, okay? It lies phonologically and semantically for now. We're not speaking contextually now. But phonologically and semantically, it lies anywhere along a certain range or domain. So the semiotic coordinates of rose, not a point, but a continuously shifting in size bubble, is what rose is. It's a bubble within the sphere, and it's continuously shifting. And this is what I call semiotic equilibrium. Okay, so the flower is an item. It's a sign that is one cluster. It's one associational matrix that one can think of in the arrangement of that sign in a language. But also there are synonyms like plant, bud, rose, which are contiguous in synonymity. The flower is one cluster. It's one cluster of signs, semiotic components, and that cluster is one associational matrix that one person can think of and one person does think of in the arrangement of that sign in a certain language. But there are also other things that we can add to develop another associational matrix, and that could be synonyms like plant, bud, rose, and these are all contiguous in synonymity. The flower is also the opposite of other things like fruit, vegetables, and it becomes clustered associationally. Now, when we say it becomes clustered associationally, we are referring to a certain language within the language or within an associational matrix. So this happens in ways that makes it available to be chosen appropriately for a certain semantic context. And we are referring to semantic contexts, semantic matrices that we try to develop when we speak. So that's how signs operate in language. And this all depends on the pathways that we choose, our intention, our situated intention. Okay, I'm going to now stop, and this is the end of our Saussurean semology. You'll see that right at the end we got a little cheeky, and we moved away from Saussure